Hey Steve, we've been bleeding the brakes on your trailer today. We found so this is the brake fluid that came out. We basically ended up flushing it out. This is the first bottle, and if you look at the very bottom, there's a bunch of crap, corrosion perhaps, in the bottom. And then we have the next bottle. It doesn't have anything in the bottom, but it's still pretty dark looking compared to brand new fluid. And then this is a little cleaner. Well, actually, yeah, maybe a little cleaner. And then, but anyway, what we did is we had to replace a hose. What was going on with your brakes? We had checked the actuator a couple years ago for you, and the actuator seemed to be working fine. And but this time the brakes weren't releasing. So what we did was, what we found was that the hose that was going from the actuator to the T on your axle, the hose was actually deteriorating, and the inner liner, oil was getting behind the inner liner of the hose, and actually the more pressure we put on, the more it was closing the hose off. It was plugged up basically. So what was happening is we put pressure on trying to bleed. We couldn't get any, at first we couldn't get any oil out. And so once we replaced the rubber line with a brand new rubber line, then we were able to get the oil through and bleed it all out and so forth. So so anyhow, your brakes are working fine now. They weren't releasing. We went ahead and replaced the bearings. The bearings were actually all right. They had water in the bearings, but they hadn't really rusted yet. But anyway, the cost of the bearings over and above the labor is really cheap. So rather than do this job over and over again, we went ahead and changed the bearings. So while we were in there, so we got the bearings taken care of, the brakes taken care of, and probably your brakes were what was making your wheel hot as opposed to your bearings. But all that heat did not do your bearings any good. So anyway, so we've got that all taken care of for you. We are in the process right now of putting some new plugs in, which we've done before, but they've gotten fouled again. We found that you had mentioned that you'd had a bump. You thought perhaps on the prop. It turned out not to be on the prop. It turned out to be that your strut had been bumped, and your strut had been bent a little bit. We were able to compensate for it with a wedge. Let me get down here on my knee. On my one good knee I got left, and show you what we did. So this, apparently the prop hadn't been damaged because that portion of the strut had been bumped, and so we had to put a wedge in the back of this strut. It's 1/8 of an inch in back, and it tapers down to nothing in front, and we glued and bolted that in place. And the other thing I think you might remember, I mentioned it, that your prop was very hard to turn. Your prop was very hard to turn, and that was robbing horsepower from you. So we've taken care of that. That by fixing that strut and setting that strut, that lined the shaft up with the bearing that's in the strut, and so that improved. You're not going to be wasting horsepower on wearing out your strut bearing. We also found that the center carburetor was not idling well. The idle mixture screw, we had to set it a couple of turns out. These others, actually, were about 3 turns total here on this one. These guys are set at about 1.5 turns out, so we leaned out your idle just a little bit because your plugs were so black. These 2 plugs were actually wet, so at low speed they weren't even firing at idle. At high speed, we're convinced that they were firing. We're going to go out and make one more test and confirm that theory, but your load mixture screw is, we think, set properly, and probably the reason you couldn't get on plane was all the horsepower that was being robbed by your bearing. So we realigned the shaft, or made sure that it was correctly aligned. It really wasn't. They move, your boat changes shape. Even from the trailer to the water, your boat changes shape a little bit. So it'll change shape in storage some. You'll see the sawdust around here. 3 of these bolts were spinning. When we tried to tighten them down, they just spun. So we pulled the bolts out. We drilled out the sockets that the bolts go into. We put a dowel rod in there, and then we re-drilled for the bolts. And we put the dowel rod in there with glue, of course, and then we re-drilled for the bolts in 3 of them. That one was okay, so you don't see any sawdust there. And over here, you see sawdust there, and we cleaned this sawdust up. So now your engine's properly bolted down. As a matter of fact, this one, the engine mount had cracked, so we've got it all glued together and clamped, and we're getting ready to put the last bolt in and clean it up for you, and then we'll do a test. So anyhow, probably the reason that you weren't getting on a plane was, I don't think, well, it was fuel related initially, and then of course I had told you that after we timed it, I didn't take it back to the lake and test it and check that it was timed where it should be, and that was the reason you couldn't get on plane when you brought it back, and I apologize for that. But we did find some more good stuff. Number one, started off with that strut, and then when we did the strut, we wanted to make sure we were aligned here and that we weren't robbing any horsepower in the strut, and so that led us to re-drilling these 3 holes. And so we're going to test probably this afternoon. Well, actually, probably for this first thing in the morning, we're going to do your test, and then we'll be giving you a call to pick it up. And again, on your trailer, we have what you're looking at is the where we bled the brakes, and we got to clean that up, of course. But anyway, that should finish you all up and put you in real good shape maintenance-wise for the year. One thing that we have learned on another engine, one thing I would suggest is this winter we go ahead and adjust the valves. They're supposed to be done, like, I think it's every 100 hours. So I'm sure that your valves haven't been adjusted since you picked it up from Fujimo, and so we should be adjusting the valves. We might do that for you before you pick it up. I just wanted to make sure that we had, I didn't want to confuse the testing issue by adjusting first and then something else being, you know, masking some other problem that we haven't corrected yet. So I'm going to do that, and then we'll probably adjust the valves for you. All right, man, thank you.